Now, the topic that I'm going to be looking at is the experience of direct democracy in Ireland, why we have it and how we have used it. It's essentially what I'll be doing is reading through a paper that I'm going to have published in the Journal of Legislative Studies, and it just examines how referendums have worked in Ireland, or why we have them to date. The Republic of Ireland has fairly extensive experience of the referendum as a decision-making tool, although I said that with some hesitation when I have so many Swiss people in the room with me. We've had 39 referendums in Ireland, but that, of course, leaves us behind Switzerland, Liechtenstein, and Italy in Western Europe. So what I want to do in the space of time that is available to me is to ask three basic questions. Firstly, what constitutional, legal, or institutional factors have helped referendums have such comparatively extensive use in Ireland? So that's the first. Like, why do we have so many referendums in Ireland? Secondly, what kind of issues have come to the fore in those referendums? Have particular issues as well predominated in referendums that have succeeded or in those which have been defeated? And thirdly, how have participation rates in Irish referendums varied? And why? And what trends can be seen in the size of the yes and no votes in Irish referendums? So that's something that I would like to have a look at as well in that regard. Now, Irish. So turning to the first question, that of the reasons why we have comparatively extensive use of referendums in Ireland. So a number of points need to be made about this. The first is that Irish referendums to date have had a number of distinguishing features. So unlike those, for example, in the United Kingdom or Switzerland, they take place exclusively at national level. And they have the further distinguishing feature that they have always to date concerned amendments to the Irish Constitution. So, as such, the driving factor for referendums in Ireland has tended to be legal necessity rather than any political choice to use referendums as a decision-making tool. Whether a referendum takes place is generally consequent on advice given by the Attorney General to the Irish government that a particular policy action renders a referendum constitutionally necessary. And that compromise between the relative claims of representative and direct democracy seems to have broad public acceptance. So, I noted that little objections seemed to be raised when the government made clear prior to the 2012 ratification process in relation to the fiscal treaty that a referendum would be held to facilitate ratification of the treaty only if one was legally required and not otherwise. It didn't seem to cause any particular controversy when the Taoiseach made that particular announcement. Now, the advent of referendums in Ireland is an entirely post-independence phenomenon. So, the 1921 Anglo-Irish treaty that led to this country's independence was actually approved by a vote of the Dáil. There was no referendum on it, and practically, if not legally, referendums became a reality in Ireland with the approval of the 1937 Constitution by referendum, which then introduced, if you like, or made provision for its own amendment by the same procedure. In actual fact, though, the referendum culture that began to blossom in 1937 had taken root long before that. An earlier referendum procedure had been included in Ireland's first 1922 constitution, but had remained unused. And the original appearance in 1922 of referendums as a method of constitutional change was one of a swathe of short-lived reforms intended to distinguish Irish democracy from United Kingdom democracy. That was supposed to be very bad, the Westminster model. We were supposed to introduce a whole lot of changes, although the changes that were introduced, actually most of them, were very quickly repealed indeed. The 1922 Constitution provided for the passage of constitutional amendments by both houses of the Oireachtas, followed by popular approval in referendum. And Article 50, it's interesting to note, of the 1922 Constitution also had the additional stipulation that either the votes of a majority of the voters on the register or 2/3 of the vote recorded would be necessary in order for a referendum to pass. If that requirement had been retained in the 1937 Constitution, fully a third of the referendums which have been approved, deemed approved under the 1937 Constitution would have failed. So I think that's interesting. The 1922 Constitution went further, though. It actually made provision for initiatives as well. Essentially, under Article 48, a petition of 75,000 voters could force a referendum at that time. Now, Article 50 of the 1922 Constitution, though, contained the seeds of its own destruction, and indeed the destruction of the 1922 Constitution as a whole. And that was because Article 50 permitted amendments to the Constitution's text by ordinary legislation during the first 8 years of its existence. Now, Ireland at this time was a post-Civil War state. There'd been a very violent conflict, and the government soon came to regard things like initiatives and referendums as basically handing over control to the opposition, against whom they just fought a war. They didn't like that very much. So very quickly, in 1928, they passed legislation that eliminated the initiative procedure from the Constitution just in time to stop De Valera from making use of that. In 1929, then, they followed up with another piece of legislation that extended the initial 8-year transition period during which the Constitution could be amended by legislation, ordinary legislation. And that act effectively buried any hope. The possibility of having referendums in 1922 remained, but really any possibility of being used. Why would you use it when you could amend the Constitution simply by ordinary legislation? So that put an end to them. And it effectively drove a horse and coach, a coach and horses through the then existing referendum provisions, and constituted the end of the 1922 Constitution itself in a way, because it could now be amended at the whim of the majority. And there were a series of court cases which didn't help matters very much. They really revealed the government to have perhaps even more power than it thought it had to amend the Constitution. And I suppose, without dwelling too long on the 1922 Constitution, I suppose what I should say is that the finding of such extensive powers to amend the Constitution by ordinary legislation was no mere legal technicality, because the deployment of analogous powers to amend the German Constitution through the use of Ermächtigungsgesetze, or empowerment laws, was to lead, as we all know, to very tragic consequences for Germany and indeed for the entire world. And the desire to avoid any recurrence of that inspired the adoption of the so-called Ewigkeitsklausel, eternity clause, in Article 79.3 of the present German Constitution, the 1949 German Constitution, and that makes certain amendments of that Constitution inadmissible. And now, I suppose compared to the German experience, the Irish experience was not too calamitous, but at the same time, the experience in relation to Article 50 was not a happy one, and the hard lessons involved were duly learned and borne in mind by the drafters of our present Constitution, the 1937 one, because in Article 51.1 of that Constitution, we got a kind of narrow focus Irish Ewigkeitsklausel. And what I meant by that is that it precluded any amendment of the 1937 Constitution's amendment-related articles. They couldn't be amended by ordinary legislation during the transition period for the present Constitution. And the relative rigidity of the Constitution that we have now in Ireland was really the direct consequence of the dangerously excessive amendability of its 1922 predecessor. Now, other lessons were also learned from the fate of the 1922 Constitution. So, for example, the political difficulties that the then government had gotten itself into by having an initiative procedure was, I suppose the lesson was learned from that, and no effort was made to reintroduce initiatives. Instead, effective control was sought to be guaranteed via the provision in Article 46 that every proposal for an amendment of the Constitution would be initiated in the Dáil as a bill, and should, on having been passed or deemed to have been passed by both houses of the Oireachtas, be submitted by referendum to the decision of the people. And to use Leiphardt's expression, the referendum process, therefore, in Ireland was designed to be both controlled and pro-hegemonic. So that was how it worked. Now, there was a transitional period, as I mentioned, for the 1937 Constitution, a fairly brief one, whereby it could be amended by ordinary legislation. That was done. There were 2 amendments, but with the expiry of that, then the era of referendums came to pass, if you like, in Ireland. From then on, the Constitution could only be amended under Article 46.2. For that reason, or partly for that reason, it wasn't actually amended again for the next 31 years. So the first amending referendum was in 1972, and that turned out to be the first of 27 separate referendums, successful amending referendums. So just to give you the figures, including the process of the adoption of the present Constitution, Ireland has now had a total of 39 referendums in total. 28 of those have been successful, including the initial adoption referendum. But those referendums have not been, as I've already indicated, I suppose, evenly spread out. So I suppose the Constitution itself was adopted, pre-World War II, and the Beatles had broken up by the time it was amended successfully for the first time. So that'll give you some idea of the space involved. So we've had essentially two periods, one with no amendments at all, and the second one with a very large number, relatively speaking, of constitutional amendments. And the era of frequent referendums looks as though it's going to continue. One possible source, of course, is something which the chair of the last discussion session we're going to have, Professor David Farrell, will be able to tell us a little bit about. It's the Convention on the Constitution, a kind of deliberate process. I'm not sure if any of you who are not from Ireland have heard about this, but a deliberative process that made a number of proposals for amendments to the Constitution. We've had referendums on two of them, the last two referendums in May 2015, one of them proposing same-sex marriage to make provision for that, and the other seeking to reduce the minimum age for eligibility for candidacy in presidential elections. The former succeeded, the latter failed. It's possible now the government doesn't propose to act on the basis of any of the other proposals for referendums, which include a variety of things, including removing provision for a kind of dead letter provision in relation to blasphemy in the Constitution, and a number of other rather obsolete provisions. But the convention experience does look likely to be resurrected, because just in recent days the Taoiseach and the leader of the largest party has proposed having a constitutional convention to look at the perennially thorny issue of abortion in Ireland. So it looks as if constitutional conventions are going to go on in Ireland, and thereby constitutional amendments as well with them, I suppose. Now, turning from the future to the past, constitutional referendums held to date in Ireland can be classified according to their subject matter, and that's the next thing that I want to look at. Gosh, I should have been going through those slides, shouldn't I, behind me? I haven't been very good in that regard, but that's all the material that I've just spoken about. So the next issue is really what political issues have come to the fore in referendums and have particular issues predominated in referendums that have succeeded or been defeated. So categorizing referendum topics generally, I hope that the wording or the lettering is big enough for you to follow it there. Basically what I've done in this is to categorize, to divide referendums according to the subject matter. In the left-hand column, I've just given each referendum one, as difficult as that might sound, one topic that I felt was what they concerned. In the right-hand column, if I felt that a referendum has maybe a number of topics, I've listed the referendum under all those topics. So the idea is to give you some kind of idea about what successful referendums in Ireland have concerned over the last 78 years. And you'll see that the largest number of referendums have been concerned with both moulding and reflecting what might be termed social change and transition in Irish society over the last 40 years. 11 referendums have been concerned with those topics, and indeed 16 if you include the referendums concerning the European Union. Referendums concerning EU treaties themselves, if you categorize them separately, have come joint second. The number of referendums on the topic is arguably, I think, more a reflection of the evolving nature of the European Union itself since 1972, rather than in relation to Ireland's relationship to it. But it's also a result of the alternative vagueness and stringency of Supreme Court jurisprudence, and in particular the ruling of the Supreme Court in Crotty and on Taoiseach, which has compelled the Irish government to hold referendums on on treaties, which the government plainly would not have had otherwise, with, for example, the Single European Act and the Fiscal Treaty being cases in point in that regard. Attempted changes to the electoral system rank joint second with EU treaties as a reason for referendums, reflecting in part at least Ireland's quest to find a model that is entirely fit for purpose. And after that, the numbers decline somewhat. The next one is overturning the effect of judicial rulings. Let's have a look at unsuccessful referendums. Sorry, let's just say unsuccessful, not successful ones. So let me see, have I got that right? Sorry, I beg your pardon. No, sorry, the first figures there, I beg your pardon, just concerned referendums generally. So successful referendums is the next one. So that heading is correct, and they're unsuccessful. So it is. I have done my headings properly. So the reasons for successful referendums and why there have been so many of them in the past 4 decades or so is one that I want to look at briefly. So, and again, that's some idea is gained by looking at this table, which uses exactly the same process at the previous one, and you'll see that 8 of 27 successful referendums have been linked to social transformations again in Ireland, and most of those to the slow but I think unmistakable transition that Ireland has been making from a monolithic, socially conservative and overwhelmingly Catholic country to a more secular and liberal society. So they include things like removing the special position of the Catholic Church, the 1996 referendum ending the ban on divorce, and most recently, of course, the May 2015 marriage equality referendum, making Ireland the first country in the world to amend its constitution by referendum to that end. I suppose the amendment introducing the constitutional prohibition on abortion in 1982 was a reversal of the general liberalising trend, but it was followed by 2 1992 referendums securing the right to travel in and out of the state, and the simultaneous rejection of an amendment that would have rolled back a liberal judicial interpretation of the original 1983 amendment. So I suppose the emergence of a state with a more liberal identity, closer to that of its European neighbours, can also be seen in the introduction of a constitutional prohibition on the death penalty as well. And there are other ones, the Children's Rights Amendment that you could say were linked to this as well. And as I've already noted, liberalising referendums look set to continue. I mentioned the blasphemy issue, which I think probably will come to a referendum sooner or later, and I think the abortion issue looks as if it's going to raise its head during the lifetime of the next Oireachtas. So you can see, broadly speaking, the issues in successful constitutional amendments more or less parallel the reasons why we've had referendums at all in the first place. You can see EU referendums coming a close second there, and changes to the electoral system coming after that. All right, unsuccessful constitutional referendums. Of course, some of them are unsuccessful, I think I've termed them there, referendums, because some amendments have also failed to win electoral acceptance, 11 of them in total since 1937. 6 such rejections have happened, have happened since 2001. And obviously, when that happens, you can see a disjuncture between the views of elected representatives and the directly expressed views of the electorate whom they purport to represent. So again, same process used in that particular table there. And I suppose the fact that 2 of those referendums, unsuccessful referendums, concerned EU treaties is of particular interest because given that amendments to EU treaties are required to be adopted unanimously by all member states, and it may add to pressure to have future steps towards increased integration adopted in the manner of the Fiscal Treaty. In other words, non-EU treaties, possibly with a provision for majority adoption rather than unanimous adoption by all of the signatory member states at the end of the day. We'll have to wait and see in relation to that. You can see a certain degree of conservatism there, changes to national electoral or parliamentary systems. So, for instance, that would include things like trying to change the system of voting. We have a super fair system of voting, proportional proportional representation by single transferable vote. The government has twice tried to change that, and it hasn't happened. But those referendums took place quite some time ago. But in the conservatism, if I can call it that, of the Irish electorate struck again even more recently in October 2013, when a government proposal to abolish the upper house of the Irish Parliament was rejected in referendum. And even more recently than that, in May 2015, what I thought was a rather innocuous proposal to reduce the minimum age for eligibility for candidacy for the Irish presidency from 35 to 21 was also defeated, the largest defeat for a referendum proposal ever. So I don't know what people have against 21-year-olds in this country, but there you go. It came out in that referendum anyway. So there we go. So, all right, so that brings me on to the next topic, which is participation rates and the relative sizes of yes and no votes in Irish referendums. Now, participation rates in Irish referendums have fluctuated quite considerably. So when a referendum involves the question of high political salience, high rates of participation can be reached, although that tends to be the exception rather than the rule. So high points in this regard were the referendum on the adoption of the Constitution itself in 1937, which, as you can see, attracted a participation rate of almost 76%. Irish accession to the European communities got a participation rate of 68%. The highest ever numerical participation in a referendum was in the marriage equality referendum recently. That got almost 2 million people to the polls. But that actually represented only a 60.5% turnout. So in actual fact, it actually only came 10th out of 39 referendums in percentage terms. And the dichotomy is explained by the increase over time in the size of the electorate. Now, they're the big ones, if you like, the big turnouts. In contrast, referendums, which are seen as involving only a purely technical amendment of the Constitution or being of only symbolic value or otherwise of little political salience, can attract participation rates which are so low as to bring the representativity of the entire referendum process into question. So as you can see there, only 29.2% of the electorate voted in the referendum on bail, little more than a third of the electorate on abolishing the death penalty, and to facilitate ratification of the International Criminal Court and on the Treaty of Nice referendum. And it's interesting, all three of those referendums were held on the same day, and that still wasn't enough to boost participation. And even recently, the children's rights referendum, only a third of the electorate bothered to turn out for those. Looked at globally, over a third of referendums have failed to draw as much as half of the electorate to the polls, and more than 70% of them have failed to attract as many as 60% of voters. You can contrast that actually with parliamentary elections, because normally they'll get far larger votes. No parliamentary election between 1948 and 1987 had a participation rate of lower than 70%. One parliamentary election attracted a turnout of almost 77%, and the last one a voter turnout of over 70, although there has been some decline over time in that regard. Now, the strategy of actually holding referendums, how do you boost referendum turnouts? Well, one strategy that has been adopted has been holding referendums on the same day as election days. That's been used on seven separate occasions, and it normally tends to be associated with higher than average participation rates. So referendums held on the same day as general elections have seen the highest turnouts. Primary example of that, the referendum on the Constitution itself in 1937, which saw the election of Eamon de Valera's Fianna Fáil. That's still the highest participation rate ever recorded in an Irish referendum. The November 1992 election, which eventually produced, as at least one person in this room will be aware, the Fianna Fáil Labour Coalition led by Albert Reynolds, that saw 3 abortion-related referendums held on the same day. The turnout there was just over 68%, and that was the third highest referendum participation rate ever. You can combine referendums with local and European elections as well. That has seen respectable referendum turnouts, and even combining referendums with elections for the largely ceremonial post of the Irish president has also resulted in considerable voter turnout. So if you look at Michael D. Higgins' election in October 2011, we had referendum votes on judicial remuneration and parliamentary inquiries that saw about 56% of the electorate turn out. Only 42% turned out for the referendum held on the same day that Mary McAleese was elected, but the topic was so dry, limitations to cabinet confidentiality, that I think we could have expected far worse participation rates if it hadn't been for the presidential election on the same day. So she didn't do too badly, I think, in that regard. Very quickly now, because I know I've reached pretty much my 25 minutes at this stage, and there are other speakers who need to follow me, but I suppose relative strength of yes and no votes. Well, the largest ever vote, I still find this one difficult to believe, the staggering 99% of votes. You generally don't see that outside North Korea, but the 99% of votes cast in favour of facilitating decisions by the Adoption Board in 1979. And as I said, for me, quite astonishing. I have to admit, I was in the no vote, or I was in the yes vote in relation to this one. The highest ever no vote by almost 8 percentage points came in the May 2015 rejection of that innocuous seeming proposal to reduce the minimum age for candidacy for the presidency to 21. I haven't quite figured out why I'm so out of fashion in my vote on that particular issue, but there you go. 24 out of 39 referendums have seen no votes from over a third of the electorate. So in conclusion, just concluding basically what I've said about that, I suppose uneven but increasing recourse to referendums over time, notwithstanding their confinement to issues of constitutional law. That's one thing that we can note. Secondly, very clear link between social transition and change and the use of referendums in Ireland. And of course, that's linked as well to the fact that the 1937 constitution was drafted at a very conservative time in Irish social history, and if you like, almost the high point of the power of the Catholic Church. And then finally, fluctuating, but nonetheless generally low popular participation rates in referendum votes, and that constitutes something of an ongoing challenge in the political system. Okay, we'll leave it there at that. Thank you very much indeed.